The boxing ring has been used and misused by all kinds of men, by boxers and battlers, frauds and failures, cheats and champions. And in the loneliest sports arena in the world, some men have shown the clear mark of greatness. The straight-backed young man handing out the punishment is one of the great ones. This film is 50 years old, and that youngster has been dead almost as long. But there are still some men who knew him, and thousands more who know the name of the Maitland Marvel. From out of a blacksmith shop he came to carve his name in fistic fame. And quickly, as his ability unfurled, he became middleweight champion of the world. Against the best he made his stand, and he died a lonely boy in a foreign land.
I'm Ray Mitchell. This is the story of Les Darcy. The fight scenes you saw were of Darcy's last fight, in which he knocked out the former world middleweight champion, George Chipp, in the 9th round. Les Darcy was a great fighter. In a few short years, this golden boy of Australian boxing grew into a legend. More, he became the standard by which all great Australian champions who followed him have been measured. Yet this boy had his last fight at the age of 20. At 21, he was dead.
Les Darcy was born at Stradbroke in New South Wales in 1895. He died in 1917, ending in honour a life which began with confusion. His birth certificate shows the family name wrongly. They were the Darcys. Edward and Margaret Darcy had 10 children, of whom James Leslie was the second. His younger brother Jack was himself a good bantamweight in the 1920s and was destined to long outlive his brother. He now recalls how Les took up boxing.
He was working for a milkman at Maitland, and he saved up enough money to... He was very keen on getting a set of boxing gloves. He was working in a place called Thornton, driving a horse and dray on the line, building the railway line at Thornton. And a chap named Danaher there, he encouraged him quite a lot to take on boxing. He must have thought he was all right. So they arranged a fight between him and a chap named Governor Balsa. And Les was 16, he may have been 20. Anyway, they built a ring out of ropes and stakes out of the bush. And anyway, Les beat him anyway. And that's, as far as I know, that was his first fight. There was some money put up, like, you know.
And then he went into a boxing tournament at Maitland, didn't he?
In Newcastle.
Newcastle.
Yes, he won 2 tournaments in one night in Newcastle, 2 finals in one night.
Jack, Les fought, Frank fought, and you fought. There must have been fighting blood. What about your father?
Well, he didn't do any professional boxing, but I believe he was very good with the bare knuckles.
It was after this Balsa fight that he became apprentice to a blacksmith, that right?
That's right, yes.
And did your father approve of that?
No, my father was very much against Les being apprentice as a blacksmith. He wanted to still work on the farm with him to help him.
I see.
My mother was very keen to have him apprentice.
But the blacksmithing would help him in his fighting, it would develop him.
It did, yes. After he started, he wasn't very big when he started at the blacksmith shop. But his muscles and arms developed, and I think it helped him quite a lot in his boxing career like later on.
The old smithy where Les Darcy worked is now a foundry. but a plaque on the wall now recalls the memory of the great boxer. The smithy gave Les a wage and helped build his splendid physique. But his real apprenticeship was served in the ring despite some opposition from the blacksmith for whom he worked, a Salvation Army captain.
When Les was at the blacksmith shop, he used to fight on a Saturday night in Newcastle, like the tournaments were mostly run on Saturday nights. Well, now, Les asked several times to have Saturday morning off. He'd even work overtime through the week. To have Saturday off so he could rest a little bit, but Salvation Army captain wouldn't allow that. So he still had to work till lunchtime, and then have a little bit of a sleep and fight on Saturday night.
Darcy had early success at the Adelphi Hall at Maitland. He was only 17, but he'd been sparring and learning and boxing well since he was 12. Maitland saw him begin his extraordinary rise with a succession of wins over the then top-liners whose names are now forgotten. Although one of them, Billy McNabb, is still alive and in his 70s. Darcy, the iron youngster with the blacksmith's muscles, was never to know the problems of aging. And McNabb is a very different man now from the days when he shaped against Les, as this picture shows. "1908 was a big year for the fight game. Jack Johnson fought Tommy Burns at Sydney Stadium, and interest in boxing was at its peak. 20,000 jammed the stadium, many of them on an average wage below $8 a week, paying more than that for a seat. The fight drew a gate which at that time exchanged for more than $50,000, and the crowd saw Johnson take Burns' world title. The keen interest in boxing was kept alive by the promoters of that fight, Hugh McIntosh, Snowy Baker, and John Wren, who by 1914 had bought out Baker and formed Stadiums Proprietary Limited, which still controls Australian boxing. When Les Darcy was on the way up, Snowy Baker ran the game, and the interest was in big-name imported fighters, not an unknown local boy.
Yes, they thought he wasn't good enough. There was a lot of good fighters around those days, and they thought he wasn't good enough to fight at Sydney Stadium. So he had 2 fights at Newtown, which he won. Olympia Stadium, Newtown. Well, then he went on from there. He fought Fritz Holland.
I believe there were a lot of supporters came down from Newcastle and Maitland.
Yes, right. There were about 6 special trains came down from Maitland and Cessnock. Maitland, Newcastle and Cessnock. Well, Holland got the decision on points, a very narrow decision. And the crowd weren't happy with the decision. They thought Les had won. So they lit little fires all over the stadium with their newspapers, and they were going to burn it down. Anyway, Snowy Baker tried hard to talk them out of it and everything like that. Anyway, he finished up putting the hose on the crowd. It was after the first Holland fight that the stadium realised that Les would be a very good draw card for them. So they took their stadium and took their solicitor to Maitland to have a look at the indenture papers Les had signed, and they found out that my mother had signed the papers and that my father had not. So therefore the solicitor said, well, the papers are not worth the paper they're written on.
Stadiums Limited bought out the apprenticeship of Darcy and Endon.
That's right, yes, they did. And then Les fought Holland 3 times later, losing the second fight in 18 rounds on a foul, just accidental foul. And then Les stopped him twice later on, I think once in Melbourne and once in Brisbane.
Fritz Holland, of course, was a cagey old veteran.
He was much older than Les and very clever and cunning. So Les was only a boy, and he was a man.
Boy in years, perhaps, but a man in the ring and superbly conditioned. Les met a lineup of hard and clever fighters, and in 1914 was offered a stadium fight against the American Gus Christie. He took the offer and signed a contract to train under the brilliant Australian heavyweight champion, Dave Smith. With his training routine at the Spit Baths in Sydney, supervised by Mick Hawkins, the friend and advisor he'd first met when he was a boy near Maitland. These men are Frank O'Rourke, a cousin of Les Darcy's, and Maury O'Sullivan, with whose family Les stayed in Sydney and who became a close friend of the young boxers.
We went to most of the fights before we met Les.
Oh, yes.
And then when Dave Smith wanted to bring him to Sydney for proper tuition. He took him to the home of the Pearces at the Spit.
Oh, yes.
That was Harry Pearce and his wife.
Yes.
That's the father of the sculler, Bob. And the Pearces, or Mrs. Pearce then, who was Miss Shankleton when we knew her, brought Les out to our place one night for the night meal. From that visit, a very warm friendship developed. And whilst it didn't happen overnight, Les came out frequently to our place on a Wednesday or a Thursday or a Sunday. And in those days, the hotels were open till 11 o'clock.
Yes.
And Les used to come to our place on the way to the stadium, and if the fight finished early, he'd come back and serve in the bar. Well, then with the war and the change of the procedure, hotels closed at 8, and then from a referendum, closed at 6.
Frank, we've read about a lot of stories about poverty.
Well, I feel that this is a wonderful opportunity of dispelling something that's been held for a long time that's been wrong. The poverty in Darcy's home was no different to the poverty anywhere else around Maitland, I would say. He came from a family of 10. They had a farm. It wasn't particularly big. They didn't have much money, but they had plenty of food, good clothing, and where would you think Darcy would get his stamina from if he was undernourished?
In January 1915, Les met the American champion Jeff Smith in a fight for a world title and lost on a disputed decision after claiming that Smith had fouled him. The referee's decision has always been considered a bad one. But Les lost the fight, although he made enough out of it to do something dear to his heart. He bought his parents a farm near Maitland and gave them a degree of security they'd not known before. Les used the farm as a training ground for his return bout with Smith, taking on the toughest jobs and further conditioning a magnificently fit fighting body. In May 1915, Darcy met Smith in the ring again, and this time there was an obvious foul. The verdict went to Les and he claimed the world title. The fight promoters withheld Smith's end of the purse, and he took Stadiums Limited to court and won his legal fight, which gave him his money. But Les held the title, defended it successfully against the then middleweight champion of Australia, Mick King, and the very next day went into camp for 3 weeks' training with the militia. The previous year, he'd tried to enlist for overseas service, but was rejected because he was a minor and didn't have his parents' permission.
Les did want to go to the war. He enlisted in Brisbane. And in those days, to join the armed forces, if you're under 21, your mother or father had to give consent.
That's right.
Now, Mrs. Darcy refused to give her consent in Brisbane, and Les was allowed to come back to Sydney. He offered down here while he was staying at our place to enlist, but again, Mrs. Darcy would not give her consent.
Les would not oppose his mother, so he continued fighting.
The original 4 seconds in Les Darcy's corner was Dave Smith, Mick Hawkins, Harry Pearce and Sid Pearce.
Yes.
And then when Dave Smith dropped out, I went in. And I was in Les's corner for the last 12 or 14 fights that he had. There was one exception. Dave Smith wanted to be behind Les the night he fought Clabby.
Oh, yes.
So I stood down in order that Dave Smith could go behind Les, because Clabby had beaten Dave on a number of occasions.
Yes.
And he felt that if he couldn't beat him, well, he had a boy that could.
The fine American boxer, Jimmy Clabby, fought him twice over 20 rounds and lost both times. Clabby later told another fighter, "Forget your KO punch, you won't knock out Darcy. And if you want to go the distance, for Pete's sake don't hurt him, or he'll knock you colder than yesterday's dinner." In 50 fights, Les scored 36 knockouts, and one of the men he fought said afterwards, "To fight Darcy is like fighting a gorilla. He's terribly strong and made of iron. He could beat any middleweight in the world, even the light heavyweight champion Georges Carpentier." Eddie McGuirty was another successful American boxer who met his match in Darcy and who was asked for advice on a way of training to meet Les in the ring. McGuirty replied, "Just practice getting up at the count of 9. His old master, trainer and friend, Dave Smith, also wound up on the receiving end when he fought his one-time pupil. At this time, there were no middleweights left to match Les Darcy. and he took on a fight that was to lead, at last, to tragedy. He fought Harold Hardwick for the Australian heavyweight title and won on a knockout. But he lost 2 of the teeth, of which he was very proud, and although they were set back into his gum, the consequences were to be drastic. By then, he was already something of a legendary figure, cast in a heroic mould and remembered in books and in photographs taken by Milton Kent. His cousin, Frank O'Rourke, recalls.
My recollections of Les Darcy, in the first place, is a young lad, always smiling, a strong, nuggety young lad, living on a farm in Maitland and being part breadwinner of the family and having a great ambition to advance his mother from ordinary circumstances into something much better. He was, I suppose, one of the most fearless and likeable lads you could possibly meet. It was a warm personality. He drew a lot, I think, from the fact that he was trying to help his mother tremendously. He was this natural-born fighter, and altogether, I think, in Maitland, he was highly appreciated, and that was proven later on when, I suppose, he proved one of the greatest heroes that Australia's ever produced as far as sport's concerned.
That's for sure.
You could say that his personality was warm and very, very friendly.
Well, I used to be, as you know, closely allied with Les in his training and in the ring. And Les trained as hard for the ordinary fighter as he did for the greatest. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink. He went to bed at regular hours. He got up early in the morning and did his road work and then his gymnasium work after. And he never let up for the 3 or 4 weeks prior to a fight. And it was his physical condition with his natural ability to fight, the instinct that was born in him that made him such a great fighter.
Well, the thing that's always amazed me, and I haven't seen Les fight in a big, important fight ever, but I do know sport, the fact that a young lad of 17, 18, 19, 20, they're the years of his fighting career, should be pitted against such mature, hard, tough men and able to beat them so easily and comfortably. I think that in itself proves his greatness.
Yeah, you mentioned he was a great hero, and he certainly was, but he was only 20 when he had his last fight, a very young boy.
Well, that's the remarkable thing about Les Darcy, I think. As I tell you, he had great success, but it never changed him. He was the same with kids around Maitland at the top of his career as he was when he was a young fellow. I myself have been in a group of kids going into the East Maitland Park on St. Patrick's Day when he sent about 30 of us in and put his hand in his pocket and brought out the necessary change to give the gateman. That was the type of thing he did always. And he was one of the first men in Maitland, if you could call him a man, he was still a boy, to have a Buick car. Yeah. Cars were very, very few and far between, and Les drove in this Buick. Some may have thought he was getting a bit flash, but they were very far from the truth. His attitude towards his mother and his concern for his mother and the success he had in the home he built her and the farm he bought her in Maitland still lies to his great credit.
Les was getting offers to go to America. He tried to enlist, but once more his mother refused permission. An unpleasant smear campaign was launched against him. And he talked this over with his friend, Mike Tobin, and spiritual advisor, Father Cody.
And then came the tragic part of Les's life. People who didn't go to the war themselves were screaming out that Les ought to go. Yeah. And the screaming came from places where you'd least expect it. White feathers, insulting letters, and all that sort of stuff that upsets a person. And then Les was offered an opportunity to go to America for 3 fights, and he was to be guaranteed £6,000. And I was with him on the morning when the offer was made. And he said, all right, I'd love to go, but what guarantee can you give me that I'll get the money? He said, well, the person concerned said, well, wouldn't you take my word for £6,000? And he said, no, I wouldn't take anybody's word for £6,000. But if you will pay to the bank in Sydney or give a guarantee, I'll be very happy to go. Now, the person concerned would not listen to that. There was another offer from another source. And again, Les asked that some guarantee be given. Again, that guarantee was refused. Well, I'll put this to you, Ray. Les was 20. Yes. With all these things in front of him, And what would a boy 20 do if he had the opportunity to go to another country to get some of the money that they promised him?
A referendum on conscription was due on October the 28th. Les stowed away on the 27th. And although the referendum was unsuccessful, the press attacked him by saying he was yellow, unpatriotic, and a dodger. On his arrival in New York, Darcy was dazzled by the promises made by promoter Tex Rickard, which were never fulfilled. The attacks caught up with him where doubt about his motives and suspected pressure from Australia prevented him from fighting a number of promised bouts. When America joined the war, Darcy became a United States citizen, giving him the chance to fight in uniform and in the ring. He went to Memphis, Tennessee to train. Here, the legacy of that fight with Harold Hardwick caught up with him. He collapsed with inflammation of the heart. On May the 24th, 1917, Les Darcy died. Australian author Darcy Nyland has been working for 5 years on a book about the young and tragic boxer.
To write a biography about Les Darcy has been an obsession with me for as long as I can remember. I settled down to work on the book about 1960. It was in 1960, and I've been with it ever since. It's been a big job involving detailed, exhaustive research to blow away the fog of error and myth that surrounds the character. I decided that it was necessary to start entirely from scratch, to interview people or talk with people who knew and loved Les Darcy and who were part of his life and times. I made it my business to go to New York, San Francisco, and Memphis in Tennessee, where he died. There in that city, I located people who remembered Darcy, who spoke about him as though he had just left them but a few moments before to walk down the street. They remembered his smile, quite vividly. They remembered his handshake, the cheerfulness with which he showed them after months of fearful persecution. Some of them still had pictures of him in their homes, the way we Australians, or many of us Australians, do. My book may or may not be a commercial success. This is not really important. My only concern has been to do the right thing by Les Darcy and all the characters in his story.
Les Darcy's body was sent home for burial. The youngster who'd stowed away to leave Australia came back in honor, but dead. The people in Australia who'd condemned him as a war dodger were shocked by his death. Small comfort for his family, for whom the only remembrance was his astonishing record and the lock of hair his mother took from his head as he lay in the coffin. Further tragedy in Mrs. Darcy's life followed when she lost another son, Frank, at the age of 20. He died in 1919 during a flu epidemic. His cousin Frank remembers with some bitterness the feelings of that week of Les's funeral.
Another thing that I remember very, very distinctly were the number of floral tributes that came to this home in Maitland on the day of the funeral, and of course throughout the weeks beforehand. And there was one floral tribute in particular I shall never forget. It came from Snowy Baker, and I think this speaks volumes because I remember my Auntie Margaret, that's Les's mother, deliberately sending that tribute straight back to America without any to-do whatsoever. I think that in itself speaks for what they thought of some of the people who had something to do with Les on the debit side in those times. There were many, many distinguished people at this funeral. As a matter of fact, trains came from north, they came from south, they came from everywhere. Maitland practically had the population of New South Wales in it. Among some of those people, prominent was William McKell, now Sir William McKell, and outstanding, I think, was Winnie O'Sullivan, that is Maury O'Sullivan's sister, who was Les's fiancée, and who had gone to America and got to his dying bedside.
It's estimated that 100,000 people filed past Darcy's body before it was buried, and that 250,000 people lined the route of the funeral cortege. It was belated recognition of the achievements of a cheerful, courageous young man who'd faced his countrymen's contempt with the same strength with which he'd faced so many tough fighters in the ring. A middleweight is said to reach his peak of greatness between the ages of 24 and 26. Les Darcy had his last fight when he was 20. Yet even if he'd lived, how much greater could he have become?